like a good or bad sign feeling for this.
Okay, huh?
Is that a good or bad sign for Cappuccino?
Like the thing is that like us advancing slides and stuff
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining, everyone. We do see that we have participants still joining the webinar, so we're just going to hold for 2 more minutes before we get started. Thanks again for joining. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and start this informational webinar on the call for community conveners on how learning happens. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Monica Kinchelow, and I'm a Senior Director here at America's Promise Alliance. And we want to welcome all of you to this informational webinar. Want to make one note, or a couple notes here at the beginning. This webinar is occurring now at 3 p.m. Eastern and will also occur tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available via our website after it occurs. And we will send an email to all registrants with that web link. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Our agenda here today is to include an overview of America's Promise. We will also give background on the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development and how America's Promise got involved in the National Commission's post-release effort. We will then discuss the context for this funding and convening opportunity and what we aim to accomplish through this call for conveners. To facilitate the development of effective proposals, we will also review the purpose of this grant, eligibility criteria, the grant-making timeline, key application components, and selection criteria. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat function as part of this Zoom meeting. We ask that you not use the question and answer button because it causes us to shift away from the slides. So if you could enter any questions into the chat function, that would be helpful. Please note that we do have quite a bit of content we want to cover, and so our plan will be to go through that content and then leave a period of time at the end to pause for questions and answers. America's Promise Alliance is a nationwide coalition of nonprofits, corporations, educators, community and civic leaders, and young people who are joined together around the belief that every young person deserves to succeed and every adult is responsible for making that happen. Through collective leadership and organized campaigns at the community level, America's Promise Alliance members work together towards the 5 promises necessary for every child to thrive: a healthy start, caring adults, opportunities to serve, an effective education, and safe places. One of the initiatives we are leading is called How Learning Happens. How Learning Happens is much more than a project or an initiative. It is a way of thinking when it comes to young people and the conditions in which they learn, develop, and thrive. We are focused on advancing our collective understanding about how learning happens and helping to fuel a growing movement to educate children as whole people, taking into account their social, emotional, and cognitive development to impact their academic growth, well-being, and overall success. How Learning Happens describes the body of work, including research and practice, that explains how children and youth grow and develop. In the last few years, brain science and social science research have come together to deepen our understanding that learning is social, emotional, and cognitive. The most powerful learning happens when we pay attention to all of these aspects, not separately, but woven together, just like how our brains work. Learning settings and youth-serving systems that reflect this understanding have a greater likelihood of achieving key outcomes for young people, including academic achievement, pro-social behavior, employability, and many others. America's Promise Alliance's work to advance this understanding about how learning happens builds on the efforts of many organizations and coalitions that were part of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. As some of you may know, the National Commission released its final report called A Nation at Hope back in January to promote a whole child approach to learning and development. Scientific research has proven that learning depends on deep connections across a variety of skills, attitudes, and character traits, which generally fall into 3 broad categories. 1, skills and competencies. 2, attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets. And 3, characters and values. Skills and competencies are shown in the center of this figure, and they represent approximately a dozen specific behaviors that decades of research and practice have indicated are important. Though they are interrelated, they can be organized into 3 areas: cognitive, social, and emotional. These skills and competencies develop and are used in dynamic interaction with 2, attitudes, beliefs, and values, which are shown in the second ring. Attitudes, beliefs, and mindsets include children's and youth's attitudes and beliefs about themselves, others, and their own circumstances. As we will discuss next, there are many ways in which these skills and competencies can show up in young people's lives. Our goal with this call for conveners is to share knowledge and spur action. We want communities to consider how social, emotional, and cognitive skills and competencies show up in the community for young people. Part of the America's Promise effort to bring the content and recommendations from the National Commission to more people is through these community convenings. In creating this convening and funding opportunity, we are seizing upon the growing momentum across the country, but we also do so with a great sense of humility about the work that is already happening in the field. On this slide, we share our sense of how social, emotional, and cognitive development work is playing out in communities. In releasing this call for conveners, we invite all of you to be part of a national learning agenda where we want to learn much more about how this looks in the field. We know that communities are in different places when it comes to shifting how young people's social, emotional, and cognitive skills are supported in a variety of settings. We also know that there is a wide range in practice and that many people are interested in examples of what full or high quality implementation means and looks like. The Commission's recommendations create a path, and we hope that these convenings can be a way to galvanize support locally. With this context, we wanted to share our priorities in this convening and funding opportunity. As you consider whether to apply and how you might respond to the questions in the application, consider the priorities on the right side of this slide. The first and second show how applications should reflect an understanding of young people's lived experiences and community context. Next, we are guided by the belief that all young people benefit from the How Learning Happens frame, and that some young people will require different or additional supports. And applicants should demonstrate that they understand this and are prepared to act on it. Finally, because we believe that young people learn and grow in many settings, not only school, we are looking for communities who will engage in collective action by pulling on stakeholders from multiple sectors. I'll now hand the slides over to my colleague Navesha, who will discuss the purpose of these convenings.
Thank you, Monica. Through this call for conveners, we want to identify 5 communities that are well positioned to achieve 3 overall objectives, which you can see on the slide. We want to make sure that they share knowledge about how learning happens, inspire action and connection across the community, and thirdly, identify 2 to 3 opportunities on which the community is poised to act. First, the sharing of knowledge about how learning happens is important because these convenings are part of a 1-year effort to learn about what is happening in the communities to advance young people's social, emotional, and cognitive development. Underpinning this application process is a learning agenda for which we will gather data about where the field is in terms of social, emotional, and cognitive practice. Findings from the learning agenda will inform ongoing work at the national and state levels. Second, convening should inspire action and connection across the community by bringing together diverse stakeholders. This is extremely important for this convening because we all know that everyone can't just do this work alone, but we all have to do it together. And thirdly, convening should result in identification of 2 to 3 opportunities on which the community is poised to act. This objective is extremely important because we want to spur action beyond the convenings. We don't want to just get people together for this convening, but we want them to be able to act on the things that they learned during these convenings to spur action. Selected communities will be supported by America's Promise, each other, and partner organizations to achieve these goals. America's Promise Alliance is advancing this understanding about how learning happens and helping to fuel the growing movement to educate children as whole people, combining their social and emotional well-being with academic growth and success. Our effort builds on the work of many organizations and coalitions to advance a whole child approach to learning and development. We understand that learning looks and feels different in different communities. So we want communities to have the autonomy to own their convening approach. However, each convening should be anchored in the community and youth needs. Therefore, the community context should drive community action and fulfill the requirements outlined on this slide. The time limitation of this convening is being roughly around 19 to 20 school year because this is part of a 1-year learning agenda. As we have mentioned, representation from multiple sectors is critical. And finally, the needs and opportunity assessment is intended to 1, document the youth and community needs that underpin the convening approach, and 2, offer some front-end accountability to inform an after-action plan. Selected communities will be supported in doing the assessment. Who applies is directly connected to who is best positioned to execute the purpose of this convening opportunity within the parameters shared on the earlier slide. Examples of eligible organizations are listed on the slide, but this is not an exhaustive list. At the end of the day, any organization that applies must be able to, again, bring together diverse stakeholders. As applicants, the approach you take to complete your application will differ based on organization, existing work, and pre-existing relationships. Regardless of your plan, successful grant proposals are positioned to do the 4 things on the slide. With this overview in mind, I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague Liz, who will begin to go through each question on the application and briefly describe what we are looking for.
Thanks, Navesha. I just wanted to make a quick reminder that you're welcome to add questions in the chat function as we go through, but we'll answer them once we've gone through all of the questions. So the application is posted within a form on our website. Please note that this website will not save responses. We encourage applicants to download the Word version of the application and transfer final responses when they are ready to submit through the website. The application is broken up into 4 main parts. First is applicant information. The second is 5 narrative questions. Each narrative question has a word limit, and this is by design. What we might lose in length, we hope to gain in responses that are to the point. Thirdly, there's a budget and budget narrative question. And finally, there's 2 check all that apply lists. The applicant information form will be used to notify the winners and will also be used to identify the main point of contact throughout the convening planning process. Multiple organizations can apply together as a community, but the full application should be submitted under one organization and contact lead. So the first narrative question is about community context. As applicants, you know more about your communities than we do. The context of the community in which young people live and work, the issues that impact your residents, and the ways that individuals and sectors collaborate to support each other is key to understanding how these convenings can have an impact. With this question, applicants should include details that clearly depict what life is like for young people in their community and how learning is impacted by these details. Information like graduation rates, employment rates, and the income makeup of your community may be helpful examples, but responses should connect those pieces to a larger story about what young people experience in their communities. Questions 1 and 2 are deeply interconnected. Question 2 is more closely about the young people themselves. For this question, applicants should define young people in the way their community defines young people. Age ranges and demographic information will be helpful examples, but may not tell the full story. We're interested in learning about young people's lives and how that impacts the way they interact with their learning environment. Responses should include details about schools, after-school programs, workplaces, and other community spaces where young people learn. This section can further explore initial demographic information from the community context question, but should be focused on the young people who are a part of that context. We want to ensure that these convenings result in action following the event, and that there is community-wide interest in developing a strong culture of action to support young people's social, emotional, and cognitive development. So question 3 is intended to uncover what existing work demonstrates that there are ongoing community efforts that fit under a How Learning Happens banner, including how those existing efforts support particular groups of students or bring action around a particular topic. Descriptions of these efforts should demonstrate that there are key players in the community leading these efforts who are open to collaboration and partnership and are also open to developing new strategies and supports. Note that these existing efforts may be limited in the sense that they're happening in a neighborhood or one set of schools, but are poised to impact more young people and influence more settings. Examples of these successes should include who was supported and what success has been achieved. Question 4 differs from question 3. While question 3 is squarely focused on the track record of whole child work in the community, question 4 is about the track record of you, the convener. Successful convenings occur when a diversity of stakeholders show up for the convening organization. So for this question, we want to know why you, the applicant, know that your community colleagues will show up for you in this effort. This should include how the convener involves young people as central stakeholders. We'd also like to know how your organization has overcome challenges to positively impact young people's lives. Responses should demonstrate how that learning from past community efforts will influence these future community convenings. And as we know, part of community context is the policy landscape for your area. And policies can be different from implemented practices, but we do recognize that at the local level, the line between policy and practice is not always clear. We believe that current practice and policy conditions may signal the community's interest and ability to expand the How Learning Happens frame within the community. With question 5, we want to get a sense of the practice and policy conditions that are already at play in the community. There are a wide range of possibilities here, but for example, an applicant could speak to policies like standards for social and emotional competencies within school settings. As another example, there may be a robust employer in the community who provides career exposure opportunities for high school-aged young people. Responses should be clear about the settings where these practices are occurring or where policies have an impact. Now I'm going to hand the slides back to Monica to close out the application.
Great, thanks, Liz. The second to last component of the application is a budget and a budget narrative. In the budget, we ask for an estimate of how the $30,000 will be spent. And for the budget narrative, we ask that you briefly share in just a sentence or two how the funding will result in achieving, or how the funding will support achieving your goals. Please note that submission of the budget Excel file is through a document upload and not the form itself. You should be able to download the Excel budget template on the web page. The budget template has 2 tabs or sheets. Sheet 1 includes the budget detail and space for the brief narrative. Sheet 2 connects to Sheet 1 as an overview or summary. The final part of the application are 2 check all that apply lists. You might note so far that none of the application requires an applicant to specifically state what would happen in a convening or series of convenings. And this is by design. America's Promise Alliance, in partnership with other organizations, will support selected communities in planning and executing each convening. That being said, we included 2 check all that apply lists to see what type of content and perspectives might be prioritized by conveners. The work of How Learning Happens is by its nature integrated and cross-cutting. Yet we recognize that convenings effectively inspire and activate action when they are limited to a few priority topics. So we encourage you to use this list to think critically about which topics your community may want to dive deeply into, and how prioritizing these topics will make a positive impact for young people. What expert perspectives or content would bring value to your community? We do not expect applicants to check every box in this list. And please note that checking a box at this stage in the application period does not bind the community or applicant to that topic in the future if you are selected. This is the second of the check all that apply lists. We ask that you consider this list in terms of the content you might lead the convening with. Think about who is on the stage or who might be on a panel or leading a strategy session. Consider how your stakeholders will be engaged and what their role might be to spur positive change once the event has concluded. On this slide, we are sharing some important dates related to this funding and convening opportunity. All applications must be submitted through the web form, including the budget upload, by 11:59 p.m. on July 24th, 2019. America's Promise will then process applications for review and notify selected communities of their selection in August 2019. We expect the grant period to begin in October of 2019 and convenings and after action effort to go through about summer of 2020. At this time, before we shift to questions and answers, we wanted to pause and thank the collaborative of funders who are supporting this convening and funding opportunity. These organizations on the slide have been longstanding supporters of whole child work, and we are grateful for their support of this call for conveners on How Learning Happens. And at this time, we're going to mute ourselves, just take a look at the chat function where I think I'm seeing some activity already. So give us a moment to just get ourselves together on those questions, and we'll join you again in a moment. And at this time, if you do have a question, we do ask you to put it into the chat function, and not the Q&A for now, just so we can manage one space for questions. Thanks. Okay, we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to answer the first section of them, and then we'll pause again so that we can reassess the incoming questions. So we've gotten a lot of questions about the availability of this presentation and the slides, and I'll just sort of reiterate that we are recording this webinar, and the slides will be available with the recording afterwards, and so we'll send that link once it's all available to everyone who is registered for this webinar. There have been quite a few questions about defining the word community, which are all fair. And so I'm going to say a general response and then try to address some of the specific questions. We do not have a definition for community, but we do believe a community is not the same thing as a state. So for those of you who might be from state organizations, we do encourage you to take a look at the FAQs where we try to explain that a state organization could apply and could do a set of convenings with a community, but you really need to define a geographic space within the state to make the most of this opportunity. We did get a question about regions. We totally appreciate that in many parts of America, a region is a community and functions as such, and so a region could be perfectly fine. And in fact, 1 to 3 counties, for example, in some rural areas of America would be a perfectly appropriate approach for this particular opportunity. Let me just scroll a little bit. I think we had a question about the needs assessment and the timing of that and what the support for that really means. So the timing for the needs assessment would be after selection and leading up to the period of time that you're doing the convening. So we can't give anything more fixed than that because selected communities will have to determine when they're doing their convening. But it is in advance. It's not sort of during or after the convening itself. And when we said we were supporting, our goal is to sort of give some parameters around the needs assessment, though we do appreciate many organizations and communities have already done pretty deep needs assessments type work and may already have a lot of data and information at their fingertips. So we are also mindful we don't want to be duplicative of existing local efforts. But America's Promise with some partner organizations will have some tools and resources available for you for selected communities. We got a question about whether this convening will have to use the National Commission's framework or a different framework, a different whole child framework based on other national models. The Commission's framework is not a required guiding framework for this. We really feel strongly that communities need to decide what makes sense for them, and that may be something that already exists or was created at the local level, or might be other national model. So I hope that is helpful there. We do feel that it needs to be whole child, social, emotional, cognitive, but in addition, paying attention to how different sectors might meet those needs. And so if it were just health, for example, or just education, I think that would not quite fit for this. As we mentioned on an earlier slide, the goal of this really is to take a multi-sector approach. We received a question about whether a convening could include leadership development for young people. America's Promise very much encourages that and would say yes, it could include leadership for young people. We got a couple questions about what young people means. What is that, a specific age range or type of young person? And our answer to that is there's multiple ways to think about that. You can think about it as an age range from 0 to 18 years old. Some communities may decide that you want to focus on 16 to 24-year-olds for various reasons related to your community context. So we don't have a specific definition. You may decide that 0 to 5 or elementary school age young people are who you want to focus on. Or you're trying to serve at all those age ranges, so 0 through 18. But we don't have any preconceived notions about who the young people are who should be supported or are served through this opportunity. Got one question about the use of grant dollars and whether it would have to only cover costs of the convening, and this is a really good and important question. So the $30,000 that are available for this could support any range of activities. So it could support bringing in experts. It could support a professional development type of activity. It could support a participatory action research type of effort. We don't have anything in particular in mind with how you spend the dollars. In fact, we encourage creativity. I think it will be a little bit of a flag if the $30,000 is only for space and like event management, or if it were only for personnel without any additional explanation of how other aspects of a convening might need to be covered. And so I think there's an opportunity in the budget narrative to explain how in-kind or other funds or space will support this effort. And that is a good question. We will actually be sure to include that in the updated FAQ. Okay, there's a question here about how many convenings should be in a community. This again is not something we are going to prescribe. So as we said, there isn't in this application any specifics of requiring you as applicants to say exactly what you would do. We will support you in the planning and execution process if you're selected. And so you may choose to do one large convening, say in winter of 2019, and perhaps that builds off of some work that's already been happening and is otherwise funded. In another community, I could imagine this playing out as multiple convenings that are slightly smaller on scale, that might be specific by sector, and then they culminate in a large convening where all the sectors come together. So we don't have a fixed number in mind. We do think there needs to be a single large cross-sector convening at some point in this grant period. But what comes before it or after it, there could be certainly some creativity and flexibility. Okay, we're going to pause again. We do see some more questions coming in, so we just want to review some of those questions, and then we'll join again to All right. Thanks for your patience. There are a lot of good questions coming in, particularly around the budget, which I started to answer, I think, while some of these questions were coming in. So if anything is still super unclear after this next round of responses, please go ahead and put it in the chat function, or we'll share a way to email us. So we got a question, excuse me, around the content of the convening strategy, and in terms of roles of the applicant and role of America's Promise. So we do feel pretty strongly that the content should be founded, or it should have its foundation in the community and the young people in the community. America's Promise will act in sort of an advisory and support capacity to help the community convener bring that content to life. And so we have access to a wide network of experts in the field, on the practice side, policy side, those who are involved in the National Commission, but also research scientists who have been involved in the Science of Learning and Development Initiative and the Science of Adolescent Learning Initiative. Because we have all these connections, we hope to be able to bring to bear and support local efforts. So that's where the collaboration between community conveners and America's Promise will happen. But at the end of the day, we feel strongly that communities are in the driver's seat in terms of content. We got a few questions about whether this is a new opportunity and whether there will be outer years funding. This is new. America's Promise released this for the first time a couple weeks ago, and we are unsure at this time about future funding. I will say, I think that interest in this and the types of applications we get will help us to inform our approach and priorities going forward. We got a lot of questions about the budget, which again, I did start to answer earlier. We don't have really strict budget requirements, except to say that it's probably not advisable to put all 30,000 into space rental, or if you're trying to do sort of a big event that it's all food, for example, or all salaries for people to plan. We do want to see some creativity and diversity of how that funding gets used, but we're also really mindful that 30,000 may not meet your full vision. And so to the extent that you have existing funds or in-kind funds, we encourage you to include that in the budget narrative piece at the end of the Excel document. We got a specific question about the difference between the administrative line in the budget and the personnel line in the budget. We view the personnel and salaries line as being funds that would cover a position, a part-time or full-time position, and admin is administrative, like overhead cost. So those are two distinct things. And the admin, we say in our FAQ, is capped at 15%. We had a question about the timing of the convening. So we had the slide on the important dates, and you noticed probably that the grant period begins in October and will end in summer 2020. And the reason it goes out to summer of 2020 is to capture some of that after action piece for convenings that might happen in spring or winter of 2020. To be clear, all the convenings will be concluded by the end of the 1920 school year. So I believe someone asked about fall 2020, and this will all be wrapped up by then. And so part of what we will build into our grant agreements is that, the convening will happen at a date and time that the community selects. And then there will be some after action work that you do with America's Promise to close out the grant period. And that does include a body of work around findings and putting together something that can be shared across the selected communities and the broader community that's interested in this work. We had a couple questions around the track record of the applying organization. And so I'll take them one at a time. So one question was around the word limits of the question and the extent to which the track record should describe all of the partnering organizations. I think our desire is that the question in the application be anchored in the lead organization's track record. So we appreciate that word limits are limiting, but for that question, please focus on the lead organization. And if it's helpful to speak to your existing efforts and the length of that, I think that's an appropriate, I think it's question 3 to put that in there. Another person asked about a 2-year-old organization and whether that would impact the track record. I can't answer that without learning more from your application and about you and your ties to the community. So it's difficult to say. I can't say that categorically 2 years is a no-go. I think the real question is combining the track record with your existing efforts and the partnership connectivity within the community. We received another question around, it was a little hard to tell, but perhaps the strength or number of partnerships or collaborations and whether we have a number in mind. We don't have a number in mind in terms of the number of partnerships, but as you'll see from the last check all that apply list and throughout the application and this webinar, we've tried to really emphasize that a cross-sector approach is important. So to the extent that the partnerships are perhaps strongest, for example, between schools and maybe the healthcare system and out-of-school time providers, that may be a strong collaboration, but it is important to us that you also bring in employers or businesses and other sectors that are impacting young people. And then one other way to read that partnership question was around attendance at these convenings. And I think, again, we have a FAQ on this. We don't have a specific number of people that we think should appear at a convening, but we do feel that it needs to be representative of a cross-sector approach. Sorry, backtracking a little back into the budget, we had a question about whether these were federal funds and could the funding go towards food and giveaways. These are not federal dollars, and so paying for food or for giveaways is appropriate and is an acceptable use of funds. Okay, we have a question about the support that I described earlier from America's Promise about bringing content experts to a community. That is separate from your $30,000 of funding. So the $30,000 is really at the community level to anchor perhaps manpower behind planning or getting youth involved or participatory action research. You know, I think there's various things you could do at the community level with the $30,000, but the support that comes from America's Promise is separate from that. Okay, we're going to pause again. We have about 10 more minutes, so we're just going to take a look again at the questions and we'll rejoin with some answers. All right, this will be the last round of questions and answers. So I'm going to go lightning fast here in the last 3 minutes of our webinar. We got a question about whether the lead organization must be a youth-serving organization. So we wanted to go into a little bit of the nuance of this. I think the quick answer is no. A lead organization doesn't have to be a direct service youth-serving organization. We think that actually well-positioned convener might be the type of community organization that works with various types of stakeholders, might do some work with youth, but also does work with parents or within a school system or with health centers, for example. So a lead organization does not have to squarely only be a youth-serving direct service organization. We got a good question about web links and whether or not that's an appropriate thing to include in the application. I think a web link could be fine. We just want you to be mindful of the character and word limit within the JOT form and consider the impact that will have including a web link. My understanding is that the JOT form doesn't reflect hyperlinks, so you would have to sort of put out the whole URL. So take that into account. We appreciate that the word limits are tight, and again, that is by design. I apologize if this sounds very obvious, but we can also Google things, and so if you point us using keywords or whatever, we can also do that. We got a question about whether it would be appropriate to use these funds for workshops. And this is important. We feel pretty strongly, we tried to set this up very early on in this webinar around the overview and purpose of these convenings. And the purpose of this opportunity is not to do direct workshops to a group of people. The goal of these convenings is to inspire action across the community, across sectors, and is to identify, share knowledge and identify areas for action. So certainly a workshop with parents could be part of an after action plan. But I think part of what we're hoping to do with the convening described here is around how what happens for parents and what's reflected there should be consistent perhaps with what employers in the community are providing young people and what the school system and after school programs are providing young people. So again, it's about that cross-sector common goal table setting. So doing just workshops with this does not fully meet the purpose as we outlined in this opportunity. We got a question about whether a proposal could build upon existing work or existing coalition work about ACEs or adverse child experiences, and we think that that type of work that might be happening in a community could be good foundational work that should be described in questions 3 and 4, perhaps, to sort of signal that foundational work, collaborative work, is already happening in the community for young people. And just to close out, I think we clarified this at an earlier round of questions, but we can get into specifics about contact experts if you're selected, but we really want you to think about how the $30,000 will support the local connectivity and collaboration. To the extent that someone gets invited from the outside, America's Promise can help with that. We will have some recommendations and a list of potential speakers or organizations that we can partner with. We will certainly work with communities to provide some of that matchmaking and support for your expertise. So we can't answer that fully right now. If you want to put it in the budget, we're mindful that things like that might change later. So at this time, we appreciate that we did our best to answer your questions. You may have additional questions, so we're going to just go to this last slide where you can find additional information. If you have any questions, you should feel free to email us at howlearninghappens@americaspromise.org. And during the application period, we will do our best to get back to you within 1 or 2 days. You'll find all materials related to this opportunity at the link that's on your slide here. And this includes the downloadable application and budget template that we described earlier. There's an FAQ document, which we will update based on a lot of the questions that were on this webinar. And there's also the application web form for final submission. We will also include this webinar recording and slides. We will also include tomorrow's webinar because the question and answer portion may be slightly different. So we'll include that on there as well. Thank you to everyone for your interest in this opportunity. We're really excited to see all of your applications, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much for your time. Bye.